On May 28, 2009, a convoy of climate-controlled crates negotiated the narrow, rain-slicked roads leading into the heart of Knapdale Forest, Argyll. Inside those crates were 11 Norwegian beavers, 3 distinct family groups that had been subjected to months of rigorous health screenings and quarantine at Whipsnade Zoo. They were the first wild mammals to be legally reintroduced to British soil in 400 years. For 4 centuries, these animals had been nothing more than a ghost in the Scottish landscape, a memory purged by overhunting and habitat destruction. The official story maintained by generations of land managers was that Scotland's rivers were now a modern industrial environment, governed by concrete, dredging, and human chemical intervention. The consensus was that the past was dead and the future belonged to engineering. But what those 11 animals did with nothing but mud, sticks, and instinct would not only reshape the hydrology of the entire region, it would dismantle the very foundation of how we believe we must manage our world. The stakes of this operation were managed with clinical precision. This wasn't a fringe guerrilla rewilding project. It was the Scottish Beaver Trial, a government-licensed scientific experiment monitored by the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland and Scottish Natural Heritage. Every movement of these 11 outsiders was tracked by a team of veterinary leads and ecologists, including Dr. Bob Bell, who oversaw the release protocols to ensure compliance with strict public health laws. On that first morning at Loch Coyle Bar, a single breeding pair slipped into the water, vanishing beneath the surface with barely a ripple. To the scientists watching, it was a data point. To the local farmers and policymakers, it was a perceived catastrophe waiting to happen. They feared flooded crops, ruined timber, and collapsed banks. They believed that a primitive rodent could never coexist with a sophisticated, human-engineered landscape. The mainstream consensus was clear. Our rivers were broken, and only millions of pounds in infrastructure could fix them. We were told that agricultural runoff was an inevitable byproduct of progress, and that flood defense required heavy machinery and straightening of the banks. This was the logical standard taught in every textbook and implemented by every municipal authority. It was a world of management where nature was a variable to be controlled, not a partner to be trusted. And for the first few months, the skeptics felt vindicated. The beavers moved slowly. They were small, solitary, and seemingly insignificant against the vast, degraded backdrop of the Scottish Highlands. But then, the University of Stirling began collecting the first round of longitudinal water samples. They were looking for the standard markers of decline high nitrogen, heavy phosphorus, and the suffocating silt of a dying river system. Instead, the data began to show a deviation that defied every established ecological model. The water leaving the beaver sites wasn't just slightly cleaner, it was undergoing a fundamental chemical transformation. While the establishment was busy debating the legal status of these pests, the 11 Norwegian outsiders were quietly performing a billion-pound infrastructure overhaul for the cost of a few willow branches. What they found in those early samples was the first crack in a 400-year-old narrative. The beavers weren't just building dams. They were constructing a sophisticated, multi-tiered filtration system that was trapping over 100 tons of sediment and reducing nitrate levels by a staggering 40%. It was a level of efficiency that no man-made treatment plant in the region could match. Think about that. The primitive was outperforming the sophisticated in real time, under the watchful gaze of the very institutions that had predicted their failure. But as the biodiversity began to surge by over 1,000%, a disturbing realization began to emerge among the monitoring teams. This wasn't just a success story about animals returning to a forest. This was a revelation that the official way of managing our planet has been a costly, arrogant delusion that ignored the world's most effective engineers for 4 centuries. And as the evidence stacked up, the institutional response took a turn that nobody saw coming. To understand why this matters, you need to know the state of the Scottish Highlands before the first crate was ever opened. For 400 years, the cradle of Britain's wild rivers had been reduced to a silent, industrial graveyard. The official story, whispered by land managers and reflected in centuries of policy, was that the loss of the beaver in the 16th century was a historical footnote, a change the ecosystem had long ago adapted to. We were told that the modern Scottish River, with its straightened banks and managed flow, was the peak of efficiency. But the physical evidence told a much darker story of systemic collapse. By the early 2000s, Scotland's waterways were suffering from what ecologists call shifting baseline syndrome, where each generation accepts a more degraded version of nature as the new normal. The measurements were undeniable. Without the natural filtration of beaver wetlands, topsoil from Highland farms was washing into the sea at a rate of thousands of tons per year. The rivers had become high-speed pipes for agricultural runoff, carrying a toxic load of nitrogen and phosphorus that choked out native fish populations. According to data from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, over half of Scotland's water bodies were failing to meet basic ecological standards. The banks were eroding, the spawning grounds were buried in silt, and the once rich, braided river systems had been forced into single, deep channels that offered no refuge for life. The Highlands weren't just changing, they were dying in plain sight. The establishment's solution was always more engineering, more concrete, more dredging. Millions of pounds were poured into artificial flood defenses and salmon ladders, trying to replicate with machines what a balanced ecosystem does for free. It was a philosophy of management that treated the river as a plumbing problem rather than a living organism. Not because it was effective, not because it was sustainable, because it was the only way the powers that be knew how to exert control over a landscape they had already broken. But in 2009, everything changed. The release of those 11 Norwegian beavers wasn't just a biological experiment. It was a direct challenge to 4 centuries of failed human management. Scientists from the University of Stirling and the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland weren't just looking for survival rates, they were looking for the first signs of a reclamation. They wanted to see if the dead status of the Highlands was truly permanent, or if we had simply removed the only architects capable of fixing it. And what they found in those first few months of monitoring didn't just surprise the experts. It suggested that our entire understanding of how a river functions was fundamentally, perhaps even dangerously, wrong. But even as the first dams began to take shape in the Knapdale mud, the data began to reveal something that the official monitors weren't prepared for. Because, as it turns out, the beavers weren't just building a home. They were starting a revolution that would eventually force the government to choose between its own policies and the undeniable truth of the water. And that's where the story takes a turn that nobody, not even the most optimistic rewilders, could have predicted. Then, the first dams appeared. It didn't take years, or even months. It happened in a matter of days. As the 11 Norwegian outsiders moved through the tributaries of the Knapdale forest, they began to do exactly what the establishment's models said was impossible in such a degraded environment. They began to build, using nothing but local willow, birch, and the very mud that had been clogging the river's arteries. These 3 family groups started to construct complex, semi-permeable barriers across the waterways. To the casual observer, it looked like a mess of sticks. To the scientists monitoring the site, it was the first evidence of a biological re-engineering project on a scale Britain hadn't seen since the Tudor era. But the reaction from the local establishment was one of immediate and intense skepticism. The official story, championed by powerful agricultural unions and landowning interests, was that these dams would act as biological blockages. They warned that the beavers would flood prime grazing land, destroy valuable timber, and prevent salmon from reaching their spawning grounds. One prominent spokesperson for the Scottish Gamekeepers Association went as far as to call the reintroduction a ticking ecological time bomb. The consensus among critics was that the beavers were an invasive force, a primitive relic that would clash violently with the modern, managed landscape of the 21st century. However, the evidence at the release sites began to tell a different story, one that left the monitoring teams in a state of genuine surprise. When experts like Dr. Bob Bell and the ecologists from Scottish Natural Heritage began to inspect the structures, they didn't find the stagnant, impenetrable walls the critics had predicted. Instead, they found sophisticated, leaky dams. These structures were designed by nature not to stop the water, but to slow it down, not because they were trying to save the river, not because they were following a plan, because their survival depended on creating a very specific kind of equilibrium. As the first autumn rains hit the Knapdale forest, the local authorities prepared for the predicted flooding. They expected the beaver dams to burst or to back up the water into the surrounding forest in a catastrophic display of natural failure. But as the water levels rose, something extraordinary happened. The dams held. More than that, they began to expand. The beavers weren't just building single walls, they were creating entire terraced systems of ponds and wetlands. While the official flood defenses downstream were struggling to cope with the surge, the beaver-managed sections of the river were calm, controlled, and increasingly clear. The first crack in the establishment's narrative had appeared. They had predicted a catastrophe of mud and chaos. What they were actually seeing was the spontaneous return of order. But as the scientists moved in to take more detailed measurements of the water itself, they realized the dams were doing something far more significant than just holding back the flow. What they found hidden in the chemistry of those first beaver ponds is what truly began to terrify the status quo. But that's not even the most shocking part of the revelation. Think about that scale for a second. We are taught that flood defense is a matter of civil engineering, requiring millions of pounds in government grants, heavy machinery, and miles of reinforced concrete. The official story claims that when a massive storm surge hits the Highlands, the only way to protect downstream towns is to speed the water away as fast as possible through straightened, artificial channels. But the data from the Knapdale experiment revealed that our sophisticated strategy was actually making the problem worse. By accelerating the water, we were simply delivering a more violent, concentrated force to the communities below. In 2012, a series of heavy storms provided the ultimate test for the Norwegian 11. As rainfall totals climbed, the monitoring teams witnessed a phenomenon that seemed to defy the laws of modern hydrology. The beaver dams didn't just hold, they acted as a series of natural shock absorbers. By creating a complex, leaky architecture of mud and willow, the beavers were effectively decompressing the river's energy. The flow meters confirmed the impossible. The peak flow, the most dangerous part of a flood, had been reduced by a staggering 30% in the sections managed by beavers. Not because they were trying to save the town, not because they had a blueprint, because they had restored the river's forgotten ability to breathe. When researchers from the University of Exeter analyzed the results, they found that these simple stick structures were doing more to mitigate flood risk than a decade of human intervention. It was a pattern recognition moment that silenced the skeptics. We were looking at a living, self-healing infrastructure that grows stronger with every storm, while our concrete defenses only decay. But as the floodwaters receded, they left behind something even more extraordinary than a dry town. Because what the receding water revealed was a biological explosion that no scientist believed could happen this fast. But the evidence didn't stop there. It accelerated. To understand why scientists were left in a state of absolute disbelief, you have to look at the timeline. The official story maintained by mainstream conservationists was that ecological recovery is a slow, agonizing process, a multi-generational effort that would take a century of human replanting and expensive nurturing to see results. We were told that a dead river stays dead until we decide to fix it piece by piece. But what happened in the Knapdale wetlands was a 1,000% surge in biodiversity that occurred in less than a decade. It began with the spontaneous return of the great crested newt, a species so rare and so sensitive to water quality that its appearance alone is considered a minor miracle. Then came the otters, the water voles, and the trout, which found sanctuary in the deep, cool pools created by the beaver dams. By 2015, the monitoring teams documented the return of rare bird species like the osprey and the crane, which hadn't been seen nesting in these tributaries for generations. According to reports from the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, the number of distinct species in the beaver-managed zones was 10 times higher than in the neighboring, professionally managed sections of the forest. Let that land for a second. 11 animals achieved a biological explosion that no amount of human funding or technology could replicate. Not through a planned intervention, not through a government mandate, because they provided the one thing human engineering cannot: a complex, living architecture that supports life at every level. It was a pattern of spontaneous, self-organizing recovery that shattered every textbook definition of restoration. You would think the authorities would be thrilled. They weren't. Instead of celebrating this unprecedented recovery, the institutional response took a turn that was both shocking and deeply disturbing. Because the next piece of evidence proves that when nature succeeds too well, it becomes a threat to the people who profit from managing its failure. And what they did next is the reason this story shifted from a biological miracle to a full-scale institutional war. Which leads us to a disturbing question. If the evidence was this clear, and the biological success was this absolute, why did the institutional response shift from skepticism to open hostility? The official story, presented by government agencies and powerful land use lobbyists, was that the trial was over and the experiment had to be concluded to protect the status quo of Scottish agriculture. They framed it as a matter of legal protocol, but the reality was far more cynical. By 2010, even as the Beavers were purifying the water and preventing floods, the Scottish government began issuing secret culling licenses. Now, here is what you need to understand about the depth of this betrayal. While scientists were documenting a 1,000% surge in life, the authorities were authorizing the state-sanctioned killing of the very animals that made it possible, not because they were failing, not because they were a threat to public safety, because they were a threat to a multi-million-pound industry built on the artificial management of rivers. When a creature provides for free what the state spends millions to replicate, that creature doesn't become an asset, it becomes a liability. According to reports from the Beaver Trust, hundreds of beavers were shot in the Tay catchment area alone, often during the breeding season, leaving kits to starve in their lodges. It was an institutional wall of silence and dismissal. They called the beavers unlicensed, as if a keystone species requires a permit to exist in its ancestral home. If you made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't look away from the truths they want to ignore. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next piece of evidence is even more disturbing. Now, back to the data. Because the establishment didn't just try to kill the messengers, they tried to suppress the evidence itself. But what they couldn't bury was the staggering physical reality of the wetlands that remained. And what those surviving wetlands revealed is the reason everything we've been taught about saving the planet is a lie designed to keep us dependent on the very systems that broke it in the first place. Let that land for a second. We have been conditioned to believe that the natural world is a fragile patient in need of constant, expensive human oversight. The official story claims that without our management, our dredging, our culling, our concrete barriers, and our chemical interventions, the environment would descend into chaos. We are taught that we are the essential stewards of a broken world. But the 11 Norwegian beavers in Knapdale prove the exact opposite. They prove that nature doesn't need our management. It needs our absence. The evidence is now undeniable. When we stepped back, the water purified itself. When we stopped straightening the banks, the floods lost their destructive power. When we ceased our professional restoration efforts, biodiversity exploded by a staggering 1,000%. This is the devastating simplicity of the truth. Our sophisticated engineering is not a solution. It is a substitute for a natural perfection we have spent centuries destroying. Not because our technology is superior, not because our science is complete, because the industrial management of nature is a lucrative industry that cannot survive in the face of nature's own efficiency. The return of these architects has dismantled a 400-year-old delusion. It forces us to ask, what other natural miracles are we currently suppressing under the guise of protection? What other extinct forces of nature are waiting in the shadows to fix the very catastrophes we are spending billions to manage? As the camera pans over the lush, braided channels of a revived Knapdale, we are left with one final, haunting reality. The solution to our most pressing environmental crises isn't found in a lab or a government manifest. It's been waiting in the mud and sticks all along. The architects have returned. The only question left is whether we are brave enough to let them work.